They called me naive, but how would you feel if you overheard your future in-laws planning to replace you after the merger? I didn't scream. I didn't run. Instead, I said yes to his proposal. And 3 weeks later, I said yes to exposing them. When their own investors watched me read their secret plan aloud, silence did the rest. I'm Emily Carter, and this is how I turned humiliation into the most elegant revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The headlights of my old Subaru carved a narrow path through the December fog curling over the vineyards. Napa Valley at dusk looked like something out of a snow globe, twinkling Christmas lights draped over hillsides, white villas glowing faintly in the distance. The Whitaker estate sat on the tallest ridge, its windows blazing gold. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel as I drove up the long private driveway. People think wealth shows in what you wear. They forget. It also shows in how you treat others. That line floated in my head like a mantra, something I'd heard my grandmother say years ago when I was still too young to understand what she meant. Tonight, I understood perfectly. I pulled the car to a stop near the entrance, killed the engine, and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Simple navy dress, modest flats, my hair tied back neatly, no makeup except a touch of lip balm. The pearl earrings in my ears had been my grandmother's, and they were probably the only thing about me that carried any real value in this moment. I looked like the woman Daniel thought I was, humble, ordinary, safely unthreatening. The Whitakers didn't know I made more in a month than most people made in a year. They didn't know I was a senior architect for a national defense software firm in San Jose, pulling in $3 million annually between salary bonuses and stocks. And Daniel, my fiancé, didn't know either. He thought I was just another mid-level tech employee with a modest apartment and a car payment. I'd let him believe that. I'd let everyone believe that. A voice came back to me as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. A person's true worth appears when they think no one important is watching. My grandmother Helen had written that in a letter the year she died. I'd memorized every word. The iron gates opened slowly, groaning under the weight of age and arrogance. Daniel stood waiting at the top of the steps, tall and handsome, in that boyish way that never quite grew into manhood. He waved his breath, visible in the cold. "You made it," he said as I stepped out. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, locking the car. His eyes traveled over me quickly, dress shoes, coat, and a flicker of hesitation passed across his face before he smiled. "You look nice." "Thanks." I tilted my head, studying him. "You sound surprised." He laughed too loudly. "No, not surprised. Just, you know how Mom can be about first impressions. She's very traditional." "Traditional?" I repeated, tasting the word. "Good to know." He reached for my hand as we climbed the steps, but his palm was damp. The door opened before he could knock. Inside the house was all marble and mirrors like a museum pretending to be a home. The scent of roasted lamb and imported wine floated through the air. A crystal chandelier hung above a grand staircase, dripping light onto the polished floor. Emily. The voice was bright and sharp. Margaret Whitaker stood in the doorway of the parlor, wrapped in red silk, her hair a flawless helmet of silver. Diamond earrings caught the light each time she moved her head. She extended her hand with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Daniel's told us so much about you. You're in computers." I took her hand, soft but cold, and smiled. "That's right, Mrs. Whitaker, I build systems." Her eyes flicked down my outfit, then back up to my face. "How practical." "Thank you," I said evenly. Daniel stepped in quickly. "Mom. Dad, this is Emily. Emily, you've met my mother. This is my father, Richard." Richard Whitaker rose from the sofa. Gray suit, tired eyes, a man who looked like he carried the weight of other people's ambitions. "Welcome," he said, voice low. "We're glad you could join us." Before I could reply, a tall woman in a black dress entered holding a phone in one manicured hand. "Sorry I'm late," she said. "The traffic was awful." Daniel smiled nervously. "Emily, this is my sister Vanessa. She's the CFO for the company." Vanessa gave me a quick assessing look. "So you're the girlfriend, or should I say, fiancé?" "Either works," I answered. She smiled thinly. "We'll see which one sticks." Daniel's shoulders stiffened. "Vanessa, What, I'm just making conversation. She sipped her wine. Margaret gestured toward the dining room. Shall we? I followed them into a room that looked ready for a magazine shoot. 12-seat oak table, silver cutlery that probably needed its own insurance policy candles arranged like a religious offering. Servants moved silently in the background. The meal started with polite chatter about weather and wine. Margaret asked about my work again, pretending to listen. You must enjoy it spending all day with technology. I do, I said. Machines are predictable, Nessa smirked. Unlike people, right? I smiled at her. Exactly. Richard tried to soften the tension. So, Emily? Seattle, isn't it? That's where you grew up, yes. My grandmother raised me there. She was a high school teacher, literature. Margaret paused with her fork midair. No parents. They passed away when I was a kid. Her tone changed just enough to sting. How tragic. Still, I suppose hardship builds character. I suppose it does, I said. Voiceover in my mind. Sympathy when spoken through a diamond necklace sounds a lot like condescension. She changed topics without missing a beat. Daniel mentioned an ex of his you might know. Alexandra Moreau. Lovely girl. Comes from an exceptional family. They're still quite close. I felt the jab but didn't flinch. She sounds impressive. Oh, she is. Nessa chimed in, swirling her wine. And single again, I hear. Daniel coughed. Vanessa, please. The table fell quiet for a beat too long. Margaret smiled as if nothing had happened. Would you like more lamb, dear? No, thank you. Dinner dragged on each course another test. I answered every question carefully, never defensive, never eager to impress. By dessert, I could almost see the tally marks in Margaret's mind background. Humble. Manners. Acceptable. Potential. Limited. When we finally stood to move to the parlor for coffee, Daniel leaned close and whispered, You're doing great. I whispered back I didn't know this was an audition. He laughed, uncertain. It's not, but it was. Every second of it was. As I followed the family toward the glow of the fireplace, I felt strangely calm. This was exactly why I'd come, to see who they really were when they thought I had nothing to offer. In that first minute, Margaret Whittaker had sized me up, priced me out, and filed me under temporary. She just didn't know that this particular temporary had a plan. The scent of lamb and wine still hung in the air as I smiled politely and took my seat ready for the rest of the show. The dining room looked warm at first glance, soft candlelight crystal glasses catching the glow, but beneath it all the air was cold, staged like everything else in that house. The 12-seat oak table stretched almost the entire length of the room, polished so perfectly I could see my own reflection between the plates. Margaret sat at the head, Richard beside her, Daniel to my left, and Nessa across from me, scrolling through her phone like the dinner was an inconvenience she intended to endure as briefly as possible. A waiter in black and white appeared, silently pouring wine into my glass. Margaret waited until he was gone before speaking. Daniel mentioned you work with computers, she said, dragging the last word out like it had a bad aftertaste. That must be very steady work, I smiled, folding my napkin across my lap. It keeps me thinking. Nessa looked up, her painted lips curling into a smirk. Do you like fixed printers? My assistant always breaks hours. Daniel gave a nervous laugh, too quick, too forced. Nessa, stop. I kept my expression polite. No, not printers. I design things that make machines think. A pause. No one asked what that meant. Margaret reached for her glass, her fingers adorned with rings that looked heavy enough to slow her down. How interesting, she said, her tone making it clear she thought otherwise. I suppose that must be very modern. Very, I said. The first course arrived. Some sort of soup served in porcelain bowls. I took a spoonful, nodding politely at the waiter who refilled my water. Margaret made a point to thank him, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Everything about her movements was deliberate, as if every gesture had been practiced in a mirror until it conveyed the exact balance of grace and authority. Even the compliments to the chef sounded like commands issued from a throne. Richard broke the silence. His voice was low, slightly rough. So, Emily, where are you from? Originally Seattle, I said. I was raised there by my grandmother. She taught high school literature. Margaret's fork paused midair. No parents. They passed when I was young. How tragic. Her tone was pure pity, but I could hear the layer beneath it, judgment disguised as compassion. Sympathy when spoken through a diamond necklace sounds a lot like condescension. I forced a small smile. She did a wonderful job raising me. I'm sure she did. Margaret said, setting her fork down. Still, it must have been difficult growing up without guidance. Daniel shifted beside me. Mom, what I'm just saying, she guided me plenty, I said softly. Nessa raised her eyebrows, taking another sip of her wine. So did your grandmother work in computers too? No, I said. She ran a small tutoring business. She taught kids who struggled with reading. Nessa nodded absently, then turned to her phone again. Clearly done with me. Margaret dabbed her lips with a napkin. That's admirable, she said. And then, in the same breath, Daniel tells me you rent an apartment near the city. Must be quite expensive these days. It's manageable. Yes, but surely you'd prefer something a bit more stable once you're married. I prefer things I can build myself, I said. Homes, careers, reputations. Richard glanced at me, then a faint flicker of interest in his tired eyes. Margaret, however, took another sip of wine and smiled. How very independent. The soup was replaced with plates of roasted lamb. The smell filled the room rich and heavy. As the waiters retreated, Margaret began another line of questioning. Have you met Alexandra Moreau? She asked casually. The name hit the table like a dropped glass. Daniel's knife froze mid-cut. Mom, Margaret ignored him. She's a lovely young woman. Her family's import company works closely with ours. Very accomplished. Poised. Such a loss when things didn't work out between you two, Daniel. I set my fork down slowly. She sounds impressive. She was, Nessa said with a smirk. Still is. Richard sighed quietly, but didn't intervene. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, looking like he wanted to vanish into the chair. I didn't realize we were talking about your family's business partners. I said, my tone neutral. I thought this was a family dinner. Margaret's smile tightened. We don't really separate the two. I've noticed, I said. Her eyes flicked to me, cool and sharp measuring. I imagine it must be hard keeping up with all this, she said, gesturing vaguely to the table, the house, the unspoken world. She thought I didn't belong to. I manage. Oh, I'm sure you do. It's just... Some people find it overwhelming, the expectations that come with a name like ours. I can handle expectations, I said. They tend to reveal more about the people who set them than the ones who meet them. The silence that followed was almost satisfying. Daniel cleared his throat, desperate to change the subject. Mom, maybe we could... But Margaret wasn't done. Daniel has always been ambitious, she said smoothly. He deserves someone who understands what it means to be part of something larger than themselves. A family legacy. I agree, I said. Legacy matters. Her expression softened, thinking she'd won. I'm glad we understand each other. I smiled. I think we do, Nessa laughed, leaning back in her chair. This is better than Netflix, she murmured. Dinner stretched on like a long negotiation. I answered every question with polite precision. Where I went to school, what I did for fun, whether I was comfortable in San Jose. Every response of mine seemed to make Margaret's smile thinner. I could tell she wanted me to trip to show some sign of insecurity or awe. Instead, I stayed calm, careful, and infuriatingly unshaken. By the time dessert arrived, some elaborate soufflé that looked too perfect to eat, Margaret's patience had frayed. I suppose you don't often have dinners like this, she said lightly. Not exactly like this, I admitted. Mine usually involve fewer interrogation points. Richard chuckled, the sound startling everyone. You've got spirit, he said. Margaret shot him a look sharp enough to silence him. I'm sorry, she said to me, voice sugar-coated. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't, I said simply. And she hated that answer. When the meal finally ended, Daniel exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. That went. Okay, he whispered as we stood. Perfectly, I said. I learned everything I needed to. He smiled, relieved, not realizing what I meant. As we moved toward the parlor, I glanced back at Margaret. She was watching me, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes, already saw me as a problem she intended to solve. I didn't look away. Outside, beyond the frost-covered windows, the vineyard lights shimmered like stars. The room glowed gold, but the warmth was only for show. The real heat, I thought, was still to come. The house had gone quiet after dinner, the kind of silence that only money can buy. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear Daniel clinking cups in the kitchen, offering to make coffee, while his mother supervised the staff clearing the table. I took the opportunity to slip away, my heels tapping softly against the marble floor. The hallway was long and dimly lit, lined with portraits of generations of Whitakers. Men in suits, women in pearls, all staring down as if daring me to measure up. Their eyes followed me smug and judgmental, painted reminders of the family legacy I'd just been lectured about. I slowed near the end of the hall where a door was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of light spilled across the floor from inside. On a polished desk sat an iPad, its screen glowing faintly in the half-dark. A new email notification had appeared at the top plan post-marriage. M. Whitaker. I froze. My heart gave a single, hard thud, then steadied. I should have walked away. I didn't. The screen brightened as I stepped closer. I hesitated only a moment before picking it up. Margaret's name filled the sender line, and just below it, my own name caught my eye in the message preview. I tapped the screen. The email wasn't long, just bullet points, concise and chilling. Maintain image until Q2 merger finalized. Public perception, stable engagement boosts investor confidence. Coordinate Alexandra follow-up post-PR cycle. My name appeared again beside a line that read, Temporary Engagement Optics. Ensure smooth exit once Moreau terms confirmed. For a moment, I didn't breathe. The air in the room seemed to shrink. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I scrolled, reading the last few lines. It was Margaret to Richard, cold, efficient, businesslike. She hadn't written about her son's future wife. She'd written about a strategy, a placeholder, a transaction. They didn't just plan a wedding. They scheduled my expiration date. I stared at the words until they blurred. The anger didn't come right away. What came first was disbelief, followed by something cleaner, clarity. Behind me, a quiet cough broke the silence. I turned sharply. Richard Whitaker stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame. He wasn't angry. He just looked tired, the kind of tired that seeps into a man's bones after too many years of compromise. You shouldn't be reading that, he said. His voice was steady but low, almost a whisper. I didn't put the iPad down. Then you shouldn't have left it open. He gave a small, humorless smile. You're right about that. I held his gaze. Do you agree with her plan? His expression faltered. For a moment, I saw something human behind the polished mask. Not anymore, he said, finally. Did you ever? He exhaled a sound that seemed to deflate him. When you've built your life on the illusion of control, it's hard to admit when someone else is pulling the strings. I'm not an illusion, I said quietly. I'm not a piece of PR. I know, he said. That's why you're dangerous to her. The way he said it made my stomach tighten. Dangerous. Not wrong. Not out of place. Dangerous. He nodded toward the iPad. Put that down, Emily. For your own sake. I set it back on the desk carefully, my fingerprints smudged on the screen. He didn't move to stop me. What happens next? I asked. That depends, he said. On whether you still plan to marry my son. I don't think you'll have to worry about that for long. He nodded once slowly, as if that answer made sense. Then I'll walk you to your car. He didn't try to justify Margaret's actions. He didn't apologize either. We walked side by side down the hall, the air between us filled with the kind of understanding that needed no words. At the front door, he stopped. For what it's worth, he said, I'm sorry you had to see it this way. For what it's worth, I said, I'm not. I said, I'm... Outside, the night air hit me like cold water. The Christmas lights still glowed along the porch railing, reflecting on the polished hood of my Subaru. The estate looked beautiful from the outside. Quiet, elegant, flawless. The way all good lies look when you're standing too far away to see the cracks. I got in the car and closed the door, the sound sharp in the stillness. My hands trembled once before I steadied them on the steering wheel. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. I looked up at the house one more time, the windows gleaming gold against the dark sky. Somewhere inside, Margaret was probably discussing me like a variable in an equation. Daniel, blissfully unaware, was likely pouring coffee for a mother who had just mapped out our fake future. I turned the key. The engine hummed softly. The drive down the winding road was slow, deliberate. The headlights stretched across the vines, cutting through fog that seemed thicker now. Halfway down the hill, I pulled over on a turnout overlooking the valley. For the first time that night, I let the silence settle. I thought about Daniel's nervous smile, about Margaret's thinly veiled contempt, about Richard's resignation. I thought about my grandmother's letter, folded neatly in the drawer of my nightstand back home. When people underestimate you, she'd written, thank them. They've just given you the advantage, I whispered to the empty car. Thanks, Margaret. Then I started the engine again. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. I stopped at a small roadside hotel just outside town, the kind with flickering neon signs and vending machines humming in the corner. The clerk barely looked up when I asked for a room. In the privacy of that cheap room, I finally let myself sit on the bed, hands still shaking. The taste of their dinner was still on my tongue, bitter now. I took out my phone and stared at the blank screen. I could call Daniel. I could confront him, demand answers, but what would be the point? He was either part of it or too weak to stop it. Neither version was worth my breath. Instead, I opened the Notes app and typed one line. They think I'm temporary. Then another. Let's make it permanent, for them. The air conditioner clicked on, humming like static. Outside, the fog rolled heavier across the valley, swallowing the estate from view. I lay back, eyes open, the ceiling spinning slowly above me. Somewhere between exhaustion and focus, a strange calm took hold. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't cry. I'd wait. And when the time came, I'd show them exactly what kind of woman they'd misjudged. 3 days later, the snow was falling hard over downtown Seattle, blanketing the city in quiet. I was half an hour late getting to the office, running on too little sleep and too much caffeine. The glass facade of Defense Tech shimmered like ice, every pane reflecting the gray-white sky. I pushed through the revolving doors, expecting another long day of code reviews and endless meetings. Instead, I froze. The entire lobby was filled with people, co-workers, managers, even the front desk staff, all gathered in a loose circle. In the center stood Daniel Whitaker in a charcoal suit, holding a bouquet of red roses, and grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. For a moment, I couldn't move. He turned when he saw me, his voice loud enough to echo off the marble walls. "Emily Carter," he called, "will you marry me?" The crowd gasped. Phones went up, instantly recording. Someone cheered. My heart didn't flutter. It clenched. Daniel dropped to one knee, opening a small velvet box. Inside, a diamond sparkled under the lobby lights, big enough to impress, not big enough to be real quality. Everything about the scene felt wrong. Too public, too performative, too perfectly timed. I could see my reflection in the glass doors behind him. A woman who looked surprised, touched, emotional. A woman who wasn't me. If he wanted a performance, I'd give him the performance of his life. I let my hand cover my mouth, feigned shock, and took a step closer. "Daniel," I said softly, as the crowd leaned in. "Of course I will." He stood, slid the ring onto my finger, and kissed me as the room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed like fireworks. I smiled for them all. My coworkers who believed they were witnessing a romantic moment. My boss who gave a little approving nod, the HR assistant already crying into her latte. Inside, I felt nothing. The applause faded, replaced by the sound of polite congratulations and whispered gossip. Someone shouted, "When's the wedding?" Daniel laughed. "Soon," he said. "Very soon." I forced a smile and leaned into him, pretending I belonged in his arms. But my eyes caught the reflection of the ring in the glass wall. Too shiny, too artificial, like the proposal itself. That evening, Margaret hosted a dinner at the Whitaker estate. The house was filled with music and laughter, guests I didn't know congratulating me, as if I'd joined royalty. Margaret floated through the crowd in a pale gold gown, champagne flute in hand, her face glowing with satisfaction. "Emily, darling," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "You were magnificent." The proposal was everywhere on social media within an hour. Daniel's assistant sent me the footage. "Absolutely darling." "Footage?" I asked. Oh yes, there were at least 3 cameras recording. One of them was mine. She laughed, delighted with herself. "Isn't it wonderful when love and publicity align?" I smiled thinly. "Wonderful," I said. Across the room, Daniel stood talking to an older man in a navy suit. One of the board members from Whitaker Motors, if I remembered right. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. The name flashing across the screen made my stomach tighten. Alexandra Moreau. Before I could look away, Daniel reached for the phone, saw me noticing, and flipped it face down. "Work thing," he said quickly. Of course. He didn't notice the way my smile didn't reach my eyes. Margaret called for attention, then tapping her glass with a silver spoon. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began. "Tonight we celebrate not just an engagement, but a future. Our family's future." People turned toward her waiting. She held her glass high. "To new beginnings and strategic alliances." The room laughed lightly, unaware that she'd just told the truth out loud. I raised my glass, my voice steady. "To truth, wherever it hides." A few guests chuckled, assuming I was being witty. I wasn't. The dinner stretched on for hours. Toasts were made, laughter forced. Margaret told stories about Daniel's childhood that sounded rehearsed. Daniel smiled dutifully, and I played my role, saying all the right words, at all the right times. I could almost hear my grandmother whispering in my head, "When you sit at a table like this, don't fight to be heard. Listen, people will always tell you who they are. By dessert, I'd learned plenty." When the guests began to leave, Margaret kissed me on both cheeks again. "You're going to be a wonderful addition to our family," she said. "I'm sure I am," I replied. Her eyes lingered on me a beat too long, like she could sense something she couldn't define. Then she smiled again, brittle and perfect. On the drive back to the city, the snow had thickened, blanketing the freeway in white. The world outside the windshield looked clean, untouched, nothing like the house we'd just left behind. Daniel held my hand on the console thumb, brushing my engagement ring. "You were amazing tonight," he said, eyes on the road. "Mom's finally warming up to you." I looked out the window, watching the snow spiral down in the headlights. "I can feel the heat," I said dryly. He laughed, not catching the edge in my tone. "You know she just wants what's best for us. I'm sure she does." We drove in silence for a while, the sound of the tires over slush, the only thing filling the space between us. I thought of that email in Richard's study, the one that had turned my engagement into a corporate event, and the way Margaret had toasted to strategic alliances. Everything was moving exactly as she wanted. But she hadn't accounted for me. As the skyline of Seattle came into view, lights shimmering through the snow, I felt the calm settle in again, the same stillness I'd felt in that hotel room in Napa. Every lie has an ending. I just needed to choose when to write it. When we pulled up outside my building, Daniel leaned over and kissed my cheek. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay? Mom wants to start talking dates." "Of course," I said, stepping out into the cold. The snow was falling harder now, quiet and relentless, covering everything it touched. I stood there for a moment, watching his taillights disappear into the white, then slipped the ring off my finger and turned it in my palm. A perfect circle. No beginning. No end. Just like the game they thought they were playing. I slid it back on and smiled to myself. Let them think they'd won. For now. The next week at Defense Tech felt colder than the winter outside. Even on the 23rd floor, the city's snow-glazed skyline looked distant, unreachable, like another planet. The office itself was silent except for the low hum of machines and the occasional buzz of keycards against security panels. Grace Turner sat across from me in the glass conference room, a steaming mug of coffee between her hands. At 45, she was the only person I trusted with both my career and my sanity. She wore confidence like armor, navy blazer, sharp bob, the kind of posture that made grown men rethink their sentences. I told her everything. Every word, every glance, every lie. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she set her coffee down slowly and leaned back in her chair. "Let me get this straight," she said. "They're marrying you off to keep a merger alive?" "Exactly." She blinked. "And you said yes," I shrugged. What better way to see the inside of the machine? Grace rubbed her temples. "Jesus, Emily. You couldn't just dump him like a normal person. I don't do normal." Her sigh turned into a small laugh. "Fair." She picked up her tablet and started typing fast. "If they're using a fake engagement to manipulate investors, there'll be a paper trail. Maybe offshore accounts, inflated valuation reports, bad R&D write-offs. You'd be amazed how lazy people get when they think they're untouchable. I'm counting on it." She glanced up. "Then we'll need receipts." By noon, she was deep into the Whitaker Motors filings, using her compliance credentials to dig through publicly available financial disclosures. I watched her eyes narrow as she scrolled. "Oh, this is messy. They've got internal loans bouncing between shell companies and..." She whistled softly. Looks like someone's charging personal jet fuel as research and development. Let me guess, I said. Vanessa? Grace grinned. You catch on fast. While she worked, I returned to my desk. My days at Defense Tech didn't stop for revenge. I still had projects to manage, algorithms to refine, deadlines to hit. But everything felt different now. The hum of the servers sounded like background music to a different kind of plan. They called me naive. But they'd never met someone who reads contracts for fun. Over the next few days, Grace sent updates through encrypted messages. They're bleeding cash, one read, trying to look solvent before the Moreau investment hits. Vanessa's creative accounting could get her jailed if anyone filed an SEC report. Not yet, I typed back. We're not ready. Every night I went home, made tea, and reviewed everything. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was focused. One afternoon, Grace appeared in my doorway holding 2 coffees. You've got to be kidding me, she said, dropping into the chair across from me. The Whitakers bought a yacht last year under a research subsidiary. They're using family assets to fund personal expenses. It's amateur hour over there. That's their problem, I said, staring at the snow outside the window. My problem is making sure when I expose them, they can't spin it. She studied me. You've thought this through. Every move. Her tone softened. Emily, when this blows up, it's not going to be pretty. They're powerful, connected, and vindictive. You'll be the villain in their version of the story. Then I'll write my own version, I said. Grace smiled faintly. You always do. Later that night, Daniel called. His number flashed across the screen as I sat at my desk reviewing Defense Tech's quarterly model. I hesitated before answering. Hey, he said, his voice light, familiar, and strained all at once. You've been quiet lately. Work's been busy. I figured. You always disappear into that place. Occupational hazard. He laughed softly. Mom's planning a Christmas dinner back in Napa. Just family, nothing formal. She really wants you there. I'm sure she does. I mean it. She's trying. You'll see. The silence stretched between us. Sure, I said finally. I wouldn't miss it. He exhaled, relieved. Good. It'll mean a lot to her. I bet it will. After we hung up, I stared at the screen until it dimmed to black. There was guilt in his voice, yes, but guilt was useless without courage. Daniel had neither. The next morning, I met Grace again in her office, a smaller, warmer version of mine, cluttered with legal texts and framed degrees. She slid a manila folder across the desk. Here's everything so far, she said. Multiple counts of financial misrepresentation, misuse of corporate funds, and tax fraud potential. Vanessa's name is on almost every questionable transaction. I flipped through the pages, my mind already racing ahead. How long until we can verify 2 weeks tops? Then we wait. Grace took a slow sip of her coffee. You're really going back there? Yep. Christmas Eve at Casa Whitaker. You're walking into a snake pit. I know. I stood gathering the files. But this time, I'm not the mouse. She leaned back, watching me carefully. Emily. I met her eyes. Don't lose yourself in this, she said. You're already ahead. Don't let them drag you down to their level. I smiled. Don't worry. I'm not going down. I'm aiming higher. That afternoon, I sat by the window in the break room, watching the snow swirl down the side of the skyscraper. The city below looked small, manageable, like a chessboard, waiting for its next move. Daniel sent a follow-up text, something about his mom's favorite dessert, and how I should wear something festive. I ignored it. My mind was already elsewhere, seeing the plan play out in sharp, inevitable sequence, the dinner, the reveal, the collapse. When the elevator doors closed behind me, at the end of the day, my reflection in the mirrored wall looked calm, composed. But beneath the surface, everything inside me was sharpening, turning precise. They thought I was the simple one, the naive one, the girl grateful just to be invited to their table. But they'd never seen what happened when I was the one setting the terms. By the time I stepped out into the cold, the streets were silver with ice, and the air smelled of snow and smoke. I tucked the folder under my arm and started walking, boots crunching against the pavement. The lights of downtown Seattle glowed like stars, reflected in glass, each one a reminder that power isn't about money or last names. It's about control. And tonight, for the first time, I had it. Snow pressed against the glass that night, a restless whisper against the window panes. Seattle in late December always felt suspended between seasons, too cold to move, too gray to dream. I sat on my couch, with my laptop open, a mug of untouched tea beside me, scrolling through the endless noise of social media. Then I saw it. Daniel Whitaker tagged in a post from a San Francisco charity gala. The caption read, "Annual Bay Area Auto Industry Ball, Raising Funds and Forging Futures." He stood in a tuxedo beside Alexandra Moreau, her hand on his arm, her smile wide and intimate. They looked comfortable, too comfortable. I clicked the image open. In one photo, he leaned close to whisper something. In another, she laughed, fingers brushing the lapel of his jacket. There it was, proof that I was the placeholder, not the partner. My stomach didn't drop this time. No tears, no shock, just the slow, steady tightening of something already expected. I saved every photo, every tag, every timestamp, then attached them to an email to Grace with a short message. "Use these if they try to rewrite history." Her reply came 2 minutes later. "This helps. It's character evidence if they try to spin the narrative. Keep your distance from him until we go live." I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling fan clicked softly, spinning shadows across the walls. My mind ran through possibilities, through contingencies. They were sloppy now, too confident, too sure that I wouldn't fight back. At work the next day, things felt off. The cybersecurity team was buzzing. Someone had flagged suspicious network activity, a small series of data access pings from external sources. I overheard snippets near the elevators. Could be corporate espionage, could be nothing, but the timing felt too perfect. By noon, I was sure of it. Someone from Whitaker Motors had noticed my data pulls. Maybe Margaret, maybe Vanessa. I told myself to stay calm. Everything Grace and I had done was technically legal. Public filings, open access databases, but perception could be a weapon. That evening, Daniel called. His name lit up my phone, and for a brief second I almost let it ring out. But curiosity won. "Hey," he said, his voice warm but tired. "You've been distant lately." I stared at the snow outside. "Just busy, saving the world." He chuckled. "You know I love that about you." "Which part?" "The world-saving part." I smiled without meaning to. "Not the distance, then." He hesitated. The silence stretched so long I could hear his breathing. "You sound angry," he said. "I sound busy." He exhaled. "Mom's been planning Christmas dinner for weeks. She's actually excited about you coming." "Excited is one word for it," I said. He laughed softly, trying to thaw the ice between us. "It'll be good, you'll see. Just family, no investors, no pressure. Promise. Promises don't mean much in your family, Emily." "That's not fair." "I know," I cut him off gently. "But it's true." He didn't argue. When the call ended, I stared at the blank screen until it dimmed to black. The apartment was silent, except for the muffled sound of wind outside. I felt like I was standing in the eye of a storm. Calm, but temporary. Later that night, an email pinged from Grace. Update: Vanessa moved $2.4 million to a Cayman account, labeled as overseas consulting. SEC violations clear as day. I read it twice. 2.4 million. The number barely registered anymore. I'd seen worse in corporate schemes, but it wasn't about the money. It was about arrogance, the belief that no one would ever notice. I typed back, "Document everything. We'll package it for Evan." Evan Miller was an investigative journalist Grace knew from a previous compliance case. The man was ruthless when it came to corporate fraud, and smart enough to know how to protect his sources. We'd decided he would be the one to carry the final strike, an encrypted dossier with everything we had. The plan was simple. We'd time the leak to coincide with the Whitakers' Christmas party, the night their world was designed to look perfect. I spent the next few days working like a machine. By day, I was Defense Tech's senior architect, reviewing code, attending briefings, approving budgets. By night, I became someone else entirely, combing through financial records, connecting dots, adding notes to Grace's spreadsheets. My dining table turned into a war map of receipts, bank statements, and cross-references. The days blurred together. Daniel called twice more. I didn't answer. Each missed call felt like another layer of distance solidifying between us. The Thursday before Christmas. Grace came by my apartment. She dropped her bag on the floor, kicked off her boots, and handed me a flash drive. "Everything's here. Evan's ready to go live when we give the word. What about Vanessa's Cayman account confirmed? We have transaction IDs, wire logs, everything. Enough to bury her 10 times over." I poured her a glass of whiskey. She raised it slightly before drinking. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm just thinking about him. About all of them." I paused, then looked up. "Do you ever wonder if people like that even feel guilt?" She shrugged. "Not guilt. Fear, maybe. They're only sorry when they lose something. Then let's make sure they do." Grace smiled faintly. "Careful. You're starting to sound like me." When she left, the apartment fell silent again. Outside, the snow had thickened into a quiet storm, muting the city below. I stood by the window watching the flakes blur the skyline. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably sitting in some restaurant with his mother, pretending everything was perfect. I opened my laptop and scrolled through the saved photos of him and Alexandra at that gala. They looked happy. Genuine. Maybe they were. Maybe he really thought this was all just business, and he was trapped in the middle. Or maybe he was exactly what his mother had raised him to be, a man who couldn't tell love from leverage. The difference between secrets and lies. Lies have an expiration date. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath. The ring on my finger felt heavier now, colder against my skin. Every choice I'd made was leading to one night, the night everything would crack open under the weight of their own deception. I sat down at my desk, pulled a notebook from the drawer, and began to write. Not code, not strategy, just words, the kind that clarified everything when the noise became too loud. I wrote about my grandmother, about truth, about the strange satisfaction of watching arrogance unravel. When I stopped, the page read, "They think I'm coming home for Christmas." They're right, just not in the way they expect. The snow outside thickened, covering the streetlights one by one. Inside, I turned off every light except for my desk lamp, its glow spilling across the plans laid out before me. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was loud, reckless. What I felt now was quiet, surgical, a clean kind of resolve. By morning, the storm would pass, and when it did, I'd be ready to end theirs. Christmas Eve in Napa glowed like a movie set. The Whitaker estate rose out of the mist, drenched in white lights, and wrapped in gold garlands that caught the cold moonlight. A row of black and silver cars curved around the driveway. Bentleys, Teslas, a Rolls-Royce at the center like a crown jewel. From the inside, laughter spilled out through the open doors. Crystal silk perfume money. Everything they wanted the world to see. They thought this night would seal their legacy. I thought it would expose it. I stepped out of the car, smoothing the skirt of my navy green velvet gown. It was elegant, simple, deliberately understated. No designer label to flaunt, no diamonds to blind the room. Just my grandmother's pearls resting quietly at my throat. A valet hurried toward me, mistaking me for staff. "Deliveries go around the back," he said. I smiled. Not tonight. Before he could stammer an apology, Daniel's voice cut through the music. "Emily." He jogged down the steps, handsome in his tuxedo, his breath clouding in the December air. He kissed my cheek quickly, his hand lingering at my waist, as if the gesture could erase everything between us. "You murdered it," he said. "Mom's dying to see you." "I bet she is," I said, keeping my tone light. The warmth of his touch didn't reach me. I followed him up the steps, each one echoing like a countdown. Inside the foyer was a cathedral of excess. A grand piano stood beside a 15-foot tree, dripping in glass ornaments. The caterers moved like dancers, balancing trays of truffle risotto and champagne flutes. Every corner glittered under chandeliers. The air itself smelled expensive. Margaret appeared from the center of it all, radiant in silver sequins that caught every flash of light. "Emily." She said, her smile wide and rehearsed. "You look festive. So do you." I said evenly, like success itself. Her smile wavered a fraction before she slipped her arm through Daniel's. "I hope you don't mind, dear, that I invited a few of our investors. This evening is as much about the company as it is about family." "Of course," I said. "What's Christmas without a balance sheet?" Daniel winced slightly, but Margaret only laughed, pretending not to hear the edge in my voice. From across the room, Nessa appeared, dressed in a black gown, dripping with diamonds. She leaned toward a man in a tailored suit, her voice pitched just loud enough. "She's from Seattle. Probably thinks Whole Foods is fine dining." Her companion chuckled politely. I reached for a glass of champagne from a passing tray, taking a slow sip. The bubbles burned pleasantly down my throat. I didn't flinch, didn't respond. Nessa thrived on reaction. I had no intention of feeding her. The wall behind the bar displayed a gallery of Whitaker family portraits. Every generation framed in gold, every face stern, wealthy, and white. My reflection hovered among them, a ghost, on the glass. Margaret guided Daniel toward a group of older men, her voice sugary sweet. "Gentlemen, this is my son, and his lovely fiancée. She's in technology. Brilliant girl, very modest background." I turned to her, smiling. "I guess we balance each other out then." The men laughed, polite, but puzzled. Daniel squeezed my hand under the tablecloth of the conversation. "Easy," he murmured. I looked at him, always. Then from across the room I saw her. Alexandra Moreau in red satin, glowing under the chandelier like a polished memory. She was talking with one of the board members, laughing at something I was sure wasn't funny. When Margaret spotted her, her face lit up. "Oh, Alex, darling," she called, waving her over. "You remember Alex, dear?" she said to me, that smile sharp enough to cut glass. "She's practically family." "Practically," I said, offering my hand. "Lovely to see you." Alexandra took it with the delicate grace of someone raised to never show effort. "I've heard so much about you," she said, the tone just soft enough to sound kind. "Daniel told me you work in coding." "Something like that, I said. "And you're in public relations, right?" She nodded, eyes bright. "Yes, family business keeps me busy. Mergers, contracts, image management. You know how it is." "Oh, I do," I said. Margaret clapped her hands together, oblivious, or pretending to be. "Isn't it wonderful seeing the two of you together? Daniel and Alex have known each other forever, practically grew up side by side." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, maybe." But Margaret kept going. "I was just saying earlier how rare it is to find people who understand each other's worlds. So many shared values. I can imagine," I said, my voice steady. "Shared values make any transaction easier." For the first time all night, Margaret's smile faltered. She looked at me sharply, then at Daniel, who avoided her eyes. The pianist began playing a slow carol, filling the silence. The crowd drifted toward the ballroom, laughter echoing off marble and glass. Daniel guided me toward the champagne table. "Please don't start a war tonight," he whispered. I smiled. "Daniel, if I start something, you'll know it." He frowned, not sure if I was joking. I wasn't. As he moved away to greet another guest, I found myself alone near the window. Outside, the vineyard stretched under the cold moonlight, 1,000 vines sleeping beneath frost. Inside, the noise swelled again. Margaret laughing too loudly, investors clinking glasses. Nessa bragging about some charity project. Every smile, every toast, every gesture was scripted. They were so busy performing perfection, they didn't realize the stage lights were about to turn on them. Alexandra passed behind me, brushing my arm lightly. "You know," she said softly, "Margaret has a certain way of testing people. Don't take it personally." I turned to her. "Oh, I don't. I take it strategically." Her smile froze. "I'm sorry." "Nothing," I said. "Enjoy the party." As she walked away, I caught Margaret watching me from across the room. Her expression wasn't hostile anymore. It was curious, like she'd suddenly realized I wasn't playing the same game. Daniel returned with 2 drinks. "Here," he said, handing me one. "You okay?" "Perfect," I said. "It's a lovely party." He exhaled, relieved. "I told you it'd be fine." "Oh, it's better than fine," I said, looking at the glittering room. "It's memorable." He smiled, oblivious. "I'm glad." But I was already thinking ahead. The music, the crowd, the decorations. They were all props. And I had just found the perfect stage for what came next. They thought this night was their celebration. They didn't know it was my setup. I lifted my glass toward Margaret across the room. She smiled back, unaware that everything she'd built was already beginning to crack. The orchestra had switched to a faster rhythm, something between a Christmas standard and a jazz improvisation. Laughter rippled across the ballroom, the kind that only sounds genuine when it's fueled by expensive wine. I stood near the edge of the crowd, watching the golden light flicker across crystal and sequins. The Whitakers had outdone themselves. It wasn't just a party. It was a statement, a declaration that their name still meant power. Margaret took the stage radiant under the chandelier. She raised her glass, her smile trained, rehearsed, perfect. To Daniel and Emily, she announced, her voice ringing through the room. "May their union strengthen both family and fortune." The crowd erupted in applause. Daniel beamed, flattered and clueless. I raised my glass with everyone else, my voice quiet enough to be swallowed by the noise. Fortune, I murmured. How appropriate. People drink to love. Margaret drinks to leverage. The champagne sparkled in my glass, reflecting the glitter of a world that was about to collapse. I took a slow sip, tasting nothing but the bitterness of performance. After the speeches, I slipped away through a side door. The night air was cold enough to sting my skin, the wind carrying the faint scent of pine and frost. The noise of the ballroom faded behind me, replaced by the hum of crickets and the occasional pop of distant fireworks. The veranda overlooked the vineyards silver with moonlight. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes. One more night, one more lie. After that, they'd have nowhere left to hide. Footsteps approached behind me, slow and measured. I didn't turn around. You were right, Richard said quietly. His voice carried a heaviness I hadn't heard before. When I looked, he stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. About what I asked. Margaret, he said. She went too far. Grace has everything. She'll send it to the SEC tomorrow morning. The cold bit deeper through my dress, but I didn't move. Then tonight's the last act. He nodded, glancing back toward the windows glowing with laughter and light. You know, there was a time when all this meant something. This company, this family, before it became about appearances. Appearances have always been their business, I said. They just stopped pretending otherwise. He sighed. I'm not defending her. I let her turn us into this. And now it's too late. It's only too late for people who can't live without control. Richard studied me for a moment. You're not like them. I'm not trying to be. He gave a small nod, then turned and walked back inside. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me alone again, with the sound of the wind moving through the vines. Inside, the party kept pulsing. I could see Margaret moving through the crowd like a conductor, her gestures sharp, commanding. The orchestra swelled as she laughed with some councilman's wife. Every move she made was a performance, and every smile cost her something. As I stepped toward the French doors, I caught sight of Nessa near the study. She stood half hidden by the curtain. Her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but urgent. No, move it now, she hissed. I don't care. Just move the funds. My pulse slowed. Grace had said she was monitoring their communications. But hearing it, watching her panic, was something else entirely. I knew Grace was listening from Seattle, recording everything. It was the final piece of evidence we needed. I turned away before Nessa saw me. A few minutes later, Daniel found me outside again. His tuxedo jacket was open tie loosened. He looked tired, and for a moment I almost pitied him. Almost. There you are, he said, relief flooding his voice. I've been looking for you. You've been quiet all night. I took a sip of champagne. Maybe I'm just overwhelmed by all the affection. He smiled half nervous. Yeah, Mom can be intense. She means well. Does she? I asked softly. Does she mean well, or does she mean business? He blinked, caught off guard. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said, turning to face him, that every toast tonight sounded more like a press release. He laughed weakly. You're reading too much into it. She's just proud of us. Proud of you, I corrected. He frowned. That's not fair. I studied him in the pale light. The man I'd once loved stood there looking at me like he didn't recognize the person in front of him. And maybe he didn't. Maybe he'd never really seen me at all, Emily. He said finally, his voice lower, softer. If something's bothering you, just tell me. Don't shut me out. I smiled faintly. It's nothing. I'm just cold. He reached out his hands, brushing my shoulders. Come inside. It's freezing. I will, I said. In a minute. He hesitated, then nodded, and went back through the doors, closing them behind him. The music swelled again, muffled through the glass. I stood there alone, my breath visible in the cold, and stared up at the stars. The sky was too still, the air too calm. Like nature itself was waiting. Inside, the pieces were already moving. Grace securing the recordings, Richard aligning himself with the truth. Nessa burying her own future under greed, Margaret smiling for cameras she didn't know would be useless soon, and Daniel still believing this was about love. I touched the pearl at my throat, the one piece of my grandmother I still carried everywhere. The wind cut through me clean and sharp. This was what clarity felt like. The kind that didn't shake you or break you, it steadied you. Tomorrow, their empire would start to crumble. I turned back toward the glowing windows, watching Margaret raise her glass again in another toast I couldn't hear. The crowd leaned in, laughing, clapping, drunk on illusion. They had no idea the storm had already begun. Midnight fell heavy over the Whitaker ballroom, the kind of hour when even laughter starts to sound nervous. The scent of cinnamon and champagne mixed thick in the air, and the chatter had taken on a sharper edge. Dessert plates clinked, the orchestra played something soft, and the glow of the chandeliers seemed just a bit too bright. Margaret took the microphone, her silver gown gleaming like armor. Tonight she began, her voice warm and commanding. We celebrate not just love, but tradition. The Whitaker legacy continues through Daniel and his lovely fiancée, Emily Carter. Applause. Polite, practiced, hollow. I felt the weight of every eye in the room as I stood from my seat. My pulse was steady. My fingers brushed the small remote hidden in my clutch. I walked toward the stage heels, clicking against the polished marble. "Mrs. Whitaker," I said, taking the microphone from her hand. "Thank you for your kind words." I smiled just enough to seem gracious. "You've given me a lot to be thankful for." A ripple of awkward laughter passed through the crowd. Even Daniel smiled uncertainly, unsure whether I was joking. In fact, I continued. "I brought a little gift for everyone tonight. A reminder that appearances can be deceiving." I turned toward the projection screen behind the stage. The lights dimmed as I connected my iPad. The ballroom fell silent except for the hum of the projector. Then the first slide appeared, a blurred version of the Whitaker Motors email chain. Names redacted, timestamps intact. Enough to recognize the words. Temporary engagement, merger security, end Q2. Gasps cut through the quiet. Someone in the back dropped a glass. "These," I said, my voice calm. "Even our internal notes from Whitaker Motors, outlining a planned merger through what they call a strategic engagement, mine." A murmur spread like fire through the crowd. People leaned toward one another, whispering disbelief, flickering into suspicion. I could see it in their faces. Their perfect party cracking at the edges. Margaret's voice cut through the noise. "That's absurd," she snapped, stepping forward. Her face had lost its color. This is private family business. Legal evidence," I said, cutting her off. "Collected through shared accounts." I made sure. The crowd turned toward me again, watching as I took a step closer to Daniel. His face was pale, eyes darting between me and the screen. "Daniel," I said softly. "You told me I made you better." I let a small pause stretch between us. I guess we were both lying. "Emily." "Wait," he stammered. This isn't." I slid the engagement ring from my finger and dropped it into his palm. The diamond caught the light, fractured it into tiny shards across the marble floor. "Don't worry," I said. "I can afford my own jewelry." He stared at the ring like it had turned into something poisonous. I turned back to the room, to the crowd of faces that had spent the night smiling politely while calculating everyone's worth. "I make $3 million a year," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The room was already listening. I could buy this house if I wanted to. "The cars outside the company you're all pretending isn't collapsing." A few people gasped. Someone whispered. "3 million. Another voice, quieter. "She's the one from Defense Tech." But tonight I continued. "I didn't want to buy anything. I just wanted to see how you treat people. When you think they have nothing." No one moved. The pianist's hands hovered above the keys, but didn't play. The only sound left was the low hum of the projector behind me, and the crackle of nerves in the air. Margaret's composure shattered first. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You've embarrassed my family. My son." "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "You did that all by yourself." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I could feel the eyes of every guest on me, watching, weighing, reassessing. The whispers started again, soft but poisonous. Investors shifting their loyalties in real time. Politicians remembering they had somewhere else to be. Daniel took a step toward me, his voice cracking. "Emily, please, let me explain." I looked at him. Really looked at him. The man I'd thought I loved, who had smiled while his family built an exit strategy around my name. "You don't need to," I said. "You already did." The pianist finally struck a wrong note. The sound echoed through the silence like a bell breaking. I turned back to the microphone one last time. My voice softened, steady as breath. "Lesson learned." I placed the mic down on the podium, the feedback humming briefly before it died. Then I walked off the stage. The ballroom erupted behind me, gasps shouting Margaret's voice, cutting through the chaos, calling my name, demanding security explanations, anything. I didn't look back. I walked through the crowd, past the stunned faces, the half-finished drinks, the glittering tablecloths. The smell of cinnamon turned sickly sweet. A woman I didn't recognize stepped aside for me, her eyes wide. Outside, the air hit me like ice. The night was still the vineyard below, silver with frost. Somewhere inside, someone was yelling. Another person was crying. I kept walking. My car waited at the end of the drive, the same old Subaru I'd driven up months ago for that first dinner. I ran my fingers over the cold metal, the familiar scratches on the door, the dent from a parking lot years ago. Behind me, I heard the muffled chaos spilling out of the ballroom. Margaret shouting about slander Nessa on her phone, Daniel calling my name once more. I opened the car door and slid inside. Through the windshield, the house still glowed gold against the darkness, a monument to pride, money, and manipulation. The kind of beauty that rotted from the inside. I started the engine. As I pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of Daniel standing in the doorway. His tuxedo jacket half unbuttoned, the ring still clenched in his hand. The light behind him flickered, casting him in shadow. He didn't chase me. He just stood there. By the time I reached the main road, the estate had disappeared behind the trees. The road ahead was empty, quiet, endless. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel broken either, just clear. It was over. Or at least the part they knew about was. 3 weeks later, the world looked different. Not quieter, just honest. The kind of honesty that comes after a storm, when all that's left is debris and truth. The first headline appeared on a Monday morning, Whitaker Motors, under SEC investigation. By noon, 3 more followed. CFO resigns. Amid fraud allegations, Whitaker family-facing legal review. Industry giant under fire for falsified valuations. Justice doesn't always come with handcuffs. Sometimes it comes with a subpoena. At Defense Tech, the air smelled of coffee and cold metal, that strange blend of productivity and exhaustion only tech buildings seem to have. I sat at my desk, half listening to the hum of servers, half watching the ticker on my second monitor. Whitaker Motors' stock price dropped 47% by noon. Grace called at 1:00 p.m. "It's happening," she said. "Evan published the piece. The evidence you gathered, the recordings, the wire logs, it's all out. The SEC just confirmed an active case file." I didn't smile. Good. By evening, Margaret's face filled every news segment, silver hair, perfect voice, trembling as she denied everything. Vanessa, pale and tight-lipped, left the company headquarters with her attorney. Daniel wasn't there. His name barely made the reports. The camera crews loved the symmetry, a dynasty undone at Christmas. Grace handled the filings herself, sending the final complaint directly to the SEC office in D.C. Her voice cracked when she called again that night. "They'll indict Vanessa. It's only a matter of time. She deserves it," I said softly. Grace paused. "You did it." No," I said. "They did. I just let the light in." On Wednesday morning, Richard Whitaker appeared before the investigators. Voluntarily. The footage showed him walking into the courthouse, coat buttoned-tight expression, weary but resolute. He confirmed the falsified reports, the off-the-books accounts, the phantom subsidiaries. Margaret was suspended from the board by Thursday. Her official statement was full of polished regret and empty accountability. "We made mistakes," she said into the cameras, "but we remain committed to transparency." Vanessa was indicted Friday morning. The entire week played out like a movie I'd already seen. The ending inevitable, the dialogue predictable. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. That Friday afternoon, I sat in my office at Defense Tech, the city stretching gray and glass outside my window. The winter sun was fading, leaving streaks of orange on the horizon. My phone buzzed on the desk. Daniel. I let it ring. Once. Twice. Then silence. Silence is the most powerful answer. He'd called 6 times that week. No voicemails, just a name flashing on the screen, waiting for forgiveness that wouldn't come. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he wanted to blame me. It didn't matter. The story wasn't his anymore. Grace showed up around 5. She never knocked, just appeared with 2 coffees, and that look of controlled chaos that meant good news. She set 1 cup on my desk. "You've been watching the circus?" she asked. Hard to miss, I said. She grinned. Stock's at $3.42 to a share. You could buy the whole company for the cost of a beach house. I'll pass, I said. Too much bad karma. She dropped into the chair opposite me, exhaling hard. You did it. You actually did it. I leaned back, smiling faintly. You say that like you didn't do half the work. Oh, please, she said. I just found the receipts. You delivered the sermon. We both laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. My office door opened and one of the HR directors leaned in. Emily, do you have a minute? Sure, she smiled politely, stepping inside. We just came from the executive meeting, effective January. You're being promoted to Chief Technology Officer. Grace let out a sharp whistle. Well, look at you. I blinked, caught off guard. That's fast. You earned it, the director said. You've been leading half the division anyway. After she left, Grace grinned across the desk. CTO, huh? I hope that pays more than $3 million. I laughed, shaking my head. It pays in peace of mind. Liar, she said, sipping her coffee. You're going to buy another car, aren't you? Maybe one that doesn't need duct tape to hold the mirror? The laughter faded into a comfortable quiet. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow against the windows. On the muted TV in the corner, the news replayed clips of Margaret entering a black car surrounded by cameras. The caption read, Whitaker Motors Future in Doubt. Grace watched for a moment, then looked at me. Do you ever think she regrets it? Any of them, I thought of Margaret's voice. Sharp, brittle, powerful. Of Nessa whispering into the phone. Of Daniel standing in that doorway, the ring still in his hand. No, I said finally. They regret losing. Not lying. Grace nodded slowly. That's fair. We sat in silence for a long time, the hum of servers filling the space. Eventually she stood. You know, for someone who brought down a dynasty, you're remarkably calm, I smiled. Revenge isn't about noise. It's about precision. She pointed her coffee cup at me. Remind me never to get on your bad side. After she left, I turned off the TV. The city lights flickered on below reflections stretching across the sound. I watched them for a while, letting the quiet settle in. The headlines would fade. The lawsuits would drag on. The Whitaker name would crumble one court date at a time. But none of it mattered anymore. For the first time in months, I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't fighting anyone. I was just still. The tea on my desk had gone cold, but I didn't care. I looked out at the falling snow and smiled to myself. Justice without noise. That was the kind I believed in. Seattle glowed that December, the kind of winter light that made every window shimmer and every snowfall look intentional. Inside the converted loft hall downtown, warm laughter mixed with the low hum of a jazz trio. Gold string lights looped along the beams, and the scent of cinnamon coffee and pine filled the air. I stood near the stage, adjusting a microphone while volunteers finished setting the last tables. Across the room, banners read, Women in Tech, Empowering Through Connection. Grace was arguing good-naturedly with the caterers about portion sizes. Her Santa-red scarf slipping off one shoulder. It had been exactly 1 year since that night in Napa. 1 year since everything I thought I knew burned down and rebuilt itself. Last Christmas I was the test. This year I am the answer. Grace caught my eye and gestured toward the mic. You're up, boss. I laughed. Your co-hosting Remember Co. means moral support. You do the talking. I stepped up to the podium, smiling, as the room quieted. Nearly 80 women, engineers, programmers, project managers, filled the space. Some had flown in from San Francisco, others from Portland. A few brought their daughters. The sight made my chest tighten with something close to pride. Thank you all for being here, I said. This dinner started as an idea between 2 exhausted women and 1 very strong pot of coffee. Laughter rippled softly through the crowd. We wanted to create a space that wasn't about competition or hierarchy or pretending to have it all figured out. Just a space where success meant lifting each other up. Applause filled the hall, gentle but sincere. I waited for the sound to fade before I reached into my folder and unfolded an old, worn letter. The paper had yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting curved elegantly, still familiar. My grandmother Helen wrote this to me the week before I left for college, I said. I think she'd approve of tonight. I began to read aloud. Wealth fades, titles vanish, but dignity endures. Don't chase recognition, my dear. Chase peace of mind. That's where real power lives. When I looked up, Grace was standing near the back, smiling. The applause that followed was soft, almost reverent. I smiled back at her. She was right. I said, "Dignity endures." The jazz trio slipped into a smooth rendition of the Christmas song. Servers began moving through the crowd with plates of roasted vegetables and salmon. The lights dimmed to a comfortable amber, and the room filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Grace appeared beside me, balancing 2 glasses of champagne. "For the Queen of Calm Revenge," she said, handing one over. "Revenge is a young person's word," I said. "I prefer justice, or closure." She raised her glass. "Closure sounds less fun." "Maybe," I said, "but it lasts longer." We clinked glasses. After a while, Grace leaned closer. "You ever think they learned anything from all that?" I swirled my drink, watching the bubbles rise. "Maybe," I said finally. "Maybe not. But karma doesn't need my help." She nodded. "Karma's efficient like that." Near the bar, one of the younger engineers was laughing with a recruiter about her first big promotion. Across the room, a mentor I'd invited was teaching a group of interns how to network without losing their souls. It was the kind of scene that would have made Helen proud. I glanced toward the small television mounted in the corner of the hall. The sound was muted, but the caption was enough. "Margaret Whittaker exits court." After plea hearing. The image was almost surreal. Margaret, once untouchable, now stood outside a courthouse, hair whipped by the wind expression drawn. Behind her, Daniel followed silently. His suit rumpled, his eyes hollow. Grace saw it too. "Looks like karma clocked in early." I said nothing for a moment, just set my glass down on the table beside me. Everyone pays their own bill eventually. The crowd around us didn't notice the screen. They were laughing, hugging, eating dessert, celebrating their own victories. Life moved forward as it should. The music softened again, shifting into something slower. A piano solo drifting through the warm air. I walked toward the tall windows overlooking the city. Outside, snow fell gently over the streets, dusting the cars and rooftops. The lights of downtown Seattle shimmered like constellations reflected on glass. A year ago, I'd stood in a different kind of light. Colder, sharper, crueler. That night in Napa, I'd walked away from chaos and into the unknown. I hadn't realized then that walking away was the real victory. Now I understood. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the final proof that they never broke you. Grace joined me at the window, her hand brushing my arm. "You okay?" "I'm better than okay," I said. "I'm free." We stood there in silence, watching the snow settle over the city. The sound of laughter behind us grew softer, turning into a steady hum. I thought of Helen again, of her quiet strength, her simple wisdom. She'd told me once that storms weren't punishments. They were clarifications. They showed you what, and who, was built to last. The Whittakers had weathered their storm and shattered. I had walked through mine and come out whole. Across the room, someone started a toast. To new beginnings, glasses clinked. Laughter rose again. I turned from the window, smiling. "To new beginnings," I whispered. The snow outside kept falling slow and steady, like peace made visible. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of the Defense Tech Conference Hall, bright and sharp against the pale snow outside. Rows of chairs filled the auditorium. Engineers, analysts, executives, and dozens of young women fresh out of college. A quiet hum of conversation drifted through the air, the kind of energy that comes before something meaningful begins. I stood at the podium, fingers resting on the edge of the lectern. My slides glowed behind me on a massive screen. Integrity and leadership. The words looked simple. The journey that had brought me here wasn't. I smiled at the audience, feeling that familiar mix of calm and adrenaline. "Good morning," I began. When I first started in this industry, I thought success was about the climb, promotions, titles, numbers in a bank account. But over time, I learned something more valuable. The room fell quiet, 100 faces leaning in. We all have power. Some wield it through money, others through truth. Choose truth. It lasts longer. The silence that followed was full, not empty. I could feel it settle through the room like a held breath. Then came the applause. Slow at first, then rising into something warm and genuine. I thanked them, stepped back from the podium, and let the applause fade. A few people came up to shake my hand as the audience began to disperse. One young woman, maybe 22, stopped me in the aisle. Her voice was soft but sure. "You make me believe that doing the right thing actually matters," she said. I smiled. It does. It always does. Even when no one's watching. She nodded, tears shining briefly before she turned to go. When the hall finally emptied, I stood alone at the front, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the quiet. I looked out at the empty seats and thought about every version of myself that had stood on other stages, nervous, angry, heartbroken, afraid. They all led here. I gathered my notes and closed my laptop. The applause still echoed faintly in my mind, but what I felt wasn't triumph. It was peace. As I walked through the lobby, the glass walls caught my reflection, calm, self-assured, free. My hair framed my face the same way it always had, but my eyes, those were different now, clearer, softer. Outside, snow drifted through the air, slow and deliberate. The city beyond the glass was alive. Buses, rumbling people hurrying with coffee cups, the rhythm of 1,000 stories moving at once. Some people learn too late that character isn't bought. It's earned. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the cold. The wind caught my hair, the snow clinging in small, melting flecks. The sound of the city wrapped around me. Horns, footsteps, laughter from a coffee stand nearby. I paused on the steps, breathing in the sharp, clean air. For a moment, I thought of Helen again, her steady voice, her lessons written in ink that never faded. I could almost hear her say, "Now you know what you were meant to build." Maybe she was right. Maybe all of this, every betrayal, every moment of doubt, was just a way to lead me here. I turned toward the street where the snow swirled under the pale sunlight and looked straight ahead. "If you believe that truth still matters," I said quietly, knowing someone somewhere would hear it, "stay with me. Leave your mark here. Let the world know we're still listening." The words hung in the cold air, honest and unadorned. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when the past finally stops chasing you. Merry Christmas. The camera would have caught the snow catching in my hair, the reflection of the city in the glass behind me, the faintest trace of warmth cutting through the cold. Then I turned and walked away, the sound of my footsteps fading into the rhythm of a world finally at peace with itself.